Morning, everyone, and welcome to this Quadrant webinar. My name is Martin. For those of you that don't know me, I'm a partner in here at Quadrant Consulting. I've been working with sales and marketing development for the past 12 years. And today we'll talk about one of the big developments that's happening in commercial organizations today. It's around teams that sell, and it's based on a book that we recently launched on how sales leaders set, build, and manage the sales teams that they're responsible for in a way that's fit with this new B2B buying and selling environment. And very shortly, the book is basically about how, although a lot of sales teams today are still set up in this traditional way where you have, let's say, a group of individual sellers not really working together, but working alongside each other. That isn't exactly the optimal way of organizing sales teams today. We'll get a little bit into why that is today. But instead, we see more and more sales organizations rethinking the sales team and organizing into teams that sell, that have different types of specialists working together in order to sell more effectively. And there's some great benefits associated with that from a business perspective. We grow sales, we reduce cost of selling because we're able to differentiate wages, we create a better customer experience, and also we drive higher employee engagement. So that's essentially what the book is about, how sales leaders are taking their organization from teams of sellers to teams that sell, the kind of business impact they get out of it, and how they actually succeed with that. And that's of course because we know that based on research that teams win in the new B2B buying environment. They're more likely to drive better performance. They are much more likely to have higher win rates on the deals that they work on when there are more people involved versus just lone wolf salespeople. And also people who are on teams are much more engaged in their work rather than people that are just set up to work individually. So in the new B2B buying environment, we know that teams beat these lone wolf setups for sales teams. And at the same time, we also know that this thing about piling on new responsibilities, new requirements to the individual salesperson is not working. We see a decline in number of sales reps that are actually meeting their quota. We see that sales reps today have much less time to spend on customer selling activities, and about 90% of them are reporting that they feel burned out and overburdened. So this way that we have solved the growing complexity so far of adding more to the individual salesperson, that's not working. What is working is getting sales teams to actually work together more as a team. And in order to explore why that is, I just want to take you guys back to the 90s before we go into the present. And if you remember the 90s, it was a little bit more of a simple time back then. The music was more simple. The Russian politicians were a little bit more predictable and simple. And selling was also more simple back then. Because selling back then was predominantly done in a more simple way. It was done through face-to-face instead of many different channels of engagement. It was done to buyers who were dependent on the salesperson for information because they weren't that well educated themselves. It was much more centralized decision making, so a few people could make decisions on different things to buy, and the products were also simpler back then. So selling it's never been easy, but it used to be a more simple thing to succeed with. And that also means that if you were a sales leader in the 90s, then you would probably be right just to hire salespeople to go sell, instead of thinking about hiring different types of specialist roles to collaborate. Because you're working in a more simple environment where you just need people to go out, talk face to face with potential buyers, a few of them, and educate them on new ways to create value through purchase of products. So back then, you would probably be right to just set up a team of sellers to go do, because it was a more simple task to succeed with. But obviously, a lot of stuff has happened since the 90s. We know that buyers are going digital and they're spending more time researching independently alone and less time actually meeting with vendors. So they spend more time researching and they can actually now finalize buyer lists and decide what they want to buy before meeting with a salesperson in the vast majority of the cases. So buyers are going digital and they're spending less time meeting with vendor salespeople. We also know that B2B buyers have a growing preference for remote interactions and less so for meeting face to face. So the research is pretty clear that even after COVID, we see that B2B buyers are sticking with a preference for remote interactions in the majority of their buying situations. And that's at growing deal levels that they're doing that. So it's not just for small purchases, but for bigger purchases as well. So there's this shift over from having met face to face all the time previously into a mix of digital, remote, and face to face interactions. There's also more people involved in the average purchase, and they're more educated than ever. So if you go back just 10 years, there was about 4 people involved in the average purchase, and that's up to about 7 today. So there's a lot more people involved, and they're using a lot more channels to educate themselves on. So they're more educated buyers, and it's also that also means that we have to up the game for salespeople, and they have to become more educated themselves. The products are also becoming more complex. So we've gone from having mainly hardware to today where we have AI-enabled software in hardware delivered as a service. So we see that the share of products or services that companies have that are fully digitalized, that's growing. And that just adds to the product complexity, where before we might have just sold hardware, then we're selling this mix of different things today. And lastly, data and technology also is growing in importance for sales efficiency. We have 3 times more sales tools today than we did just 4 years ago. So the tech landscape is growing. And we know that those sales organizations that excel at taking advantage of technology and data also outperform the rest. So data and technology becoming more important. So what does all of this mean? Well, it basically just means that if we look at it from a salesperson's perspective and look at customer drivers in the external environment, we see that more people are becoming involved in the average purchase. Buyers are becoming more educated. They allocate less time to meeting with salespeople. So essentially, the customer environment that salespeople have to sell into, that's becoming more complex to succeed in. And at the same time, the internal environment that salespeople operate in, that's becoming more complex too, because products are being launched more frequently. They're more complex to succeed with. They require more collaboration between different departments to take those products to market. Bigger dependency on data and technology. So complexity is just growing here. So the way we need to buy and sell, that's changing, and it's towards becoming more complex to succeed with, where in the 90s, it was done face to face, more simple products to less educated buyers. Today, that has shifted over where you're dealing with a bigger buying committee. It's around more complex solutions and they're more educated than ever. So it's becoming more complex to succeed with selling. That's the context in which we have this exercise that we ask sales leaders to do whenever we do sales leadership workshops around teams that sell and how to set the right sales team for different types of organizations. I just want you guys to think about this exercise as well. The question is essentially around, you're the head of sales and marketing, you have a small budget of 1.5 million euros, and you have to set the team of people that you believe would be most effective at taking your products to market. So who would you pick for your team if you only had 1.5 million euros in budget to do so? And of course, you have sales executives you could choose from. These are the specialists in managing high complexity opportunities, high complexity accounts. You have maybe inside sales reps you could hire as well, cost a little bit less, and they could excel at lower complexity tasks, 100% remote, they would complete them at a different price point than the sales executives. Maybe even a pre-sales rep that will take care of all the initial prospecting qualification work, data gathering, lead qualification. You might consider a technical specialist too, that isn't necessarily excelling at sales activities, but they're very, very good at making sure that when a more complex product is bought, that those technical decision makers that could be involved from the buying committee side, that they're engaged with as well, and we demonstrate the technical feasibility and value of the product that we're trying to sell. Could be that you want a marketing specialist on here, a RevOps manager, and of course a sales manager as well. So the task that sales leaders have to do here is that knowing that the buying environment is changing towards becoming more complex to engage with, more decision makers involved, more digital behavior, more remote behavior, so that the buying environment is changing, and so are the kind of products that we're launching. And you have these different roles you could choose from. And what we see time after time when we do this exercise is that, of course, no one anymore just chooses to have 5 sales executives and a manager. What almost everyone chooses is a combination of these different specialist roles that work together to win. 3 sales executives, some inside sales rep, a technical specialist, and a marketing specialist. And the point isn't that what the exact right composition of the team here is, but the point is that we know that no one actually would today pick 5 sales executives and a sales manager to be their selling team. Everyone picks a combination of those different roles that you have to play around with. And that's because in the old world, traditional salespeople, they were more than capable of doing everything themselves because it was a lower complexity selling environment. Fewer, less educated people involved, primarily happening through face-to-face interactions. But in the new world, there's more educated people involved. It happens through a mix of different channels. So we require a team that have different types of specialists involved in order to most effectively take products to market. And that's essentially what's happening in today's buying environment, is that most often we don't require a team of sellers to take our product most effectively to market. What we do require is a team of different specialists that are able to work together in order to take products to market. And essentially that has to do with complexity. So if you think about these 2 different ways of organizing sales teams, you have groups of individuals, and then you have teams that collaborate where there are different roles that work together. And what we know from research is that whenever you have groups of individuals, that is the ideal solution where you have simple tasks to succeed with, because you want to minimize coordination tasks, and there's not much value to be gotten out of having different people coordinating and collaborating. So for very simple tasks, that is the most effective way of solving problems. But whenever we have more complex problems, like, let's say, sending a rocket to the moon, then we know that we need different types of specialists. We need an engineer, we need a technical specialist, a data engineer. So we need many different specialists to work together in order to get more complex things solved. And complexity is growing in B2B sales. And that's why we have a growing need to get different types of specialists to work together, is because both in the customer environment and the internal environment, complexity is increasing for sales to succeed with. And that's why we're moving to this. And it works really well, because what we cannot do with a group of individuals is lift the sales effectiveness and efficiency curve. So we basically just add more salespeople whenever we need to grow sales and add cost at the same rate. But what we're able to do when we play around with the composition of sales teams is actually to increase the slope of the sales efficiency and effectiveness curve. So we're able to get more out of the money that we spent on selling. This is essentially the case around that no one would hire 5 sales executives at 250,000 euros or dollars per year, but everyone would play around with a combination because they thought they would get more from their money by doing that. So that's the first part. We're moving towards teams that sell because complexity is growing. But The question is, of course, who would you need to hire for different types of selling situations? And the challenge for sales leaders here is really one about the fact that there's not really a one size fits all when it comes to Salesforce organization in a B2B context. I just want you guys to imagine this example here where the heads of sales in GE Aviation and HubSpot would have to agree on one shared way of selling. That would, of course, be very difficult for them to do. And if they had to do it, none of them would really end up with a way of selling that fit their specific company. And that's because their characteristics are different. GE Aviation have a highly technical product that they're selling that is complex to take to market. It's jet engines. HubSpot has a less technical product. It's more easy to sell to marketing professionals. So the buying characteristics are different in GE Aviation than it is in HubSpot. And that also means that the type of sales methodology they should use will differ, the type of sales process they will use will differ, and the requirements to win in their specific business environment will also differ. Where GE Aviation, they have to succeed with managing these high complexity purchasing processes, making sure they can engage with technical stakeholders who have a big saying in their purchasing processes, marketing supports with account-based marketing mainly, and sales enablement over buying enablement is what RevOps would do. And that would look different for HubSpot. So there's no one size fits all. We have different ways of selling depending on the company that you have and the specific business context you operate in. So as a sales leader, if you're trying to figure out, well, what's the right way of selling for me, and how should I set my sales team around that? Essentially, there are two types of questions that you're considering. There could be a bunch more, but this is essentially what it boils down to. One, how complex is the offering that's being bought or sold? So is it a low complexity offering, or is it a high complexity solution? Is it low complexity like HubSpot, which is more simple, easy to approach, or are we trying to sell jet engines for airplanes? And the other one is how value is predominantly realized for the customer. Is it primarily through the product performance itself? That would be when you have something like a jet engine. It's primarily through the product performance itself that the value is delivered to the customer, where something like HubSpot requires a change in the organization and that they do something different in order for it to have value. So we're looking at these two different questions. How complex is the offering to buy? And how is the value primarily delivered to the customer? And for something like GE Aviation, we see that it's high complexity and is primarily delivered through the product performance of the jet engines, and that we call technical sales. Then we have HubSpot on the other corner here, where it's less complex and it's primarily delivered through change in the organization by those who have to use the product here, and they would use something called consultative selling. Then we have, when we go up to the more complex, enterprise selling, where it's higher complexity, but it's still that in order to get value out of the offerings being sold, it requires a change in the organization and that someone has to do something different there. And then transactional sales, lastly, which is where it's through product performance and it's low complexity. This would be something like selling insurances to private individuals or companies that are low in complexity, and it doesn't really require much change. Once you bought them, then you get the value from the product performance itself. And lastly, of course, you have partner sales, which is a little bit more difficult to place in one of these boxes, because essentially it could be different types of partner sales that we're running. Could be high complexity, low complexity, and could be for different types of offerings. So there's a million ways that you could organize sales teams, but essentially they will always sort of revolve around these 5 different archetypes here. Either it's a very technical sales team that you're trying to make, where it requires technical expertise in the solutions being sold. These would be the kind of sales teams that would often hire engineers or PhDs as part of the sales team and give them selling responsibility. Then you have enterprise sales, where it is more around the business itself expertise in the target audience that they're meeting with, and these would more likely hire business people in order to engage with business people, because the value isn't necessarily from the technical side, but it's from the business change side. Then there's transactional, which is more of an efficiency gain. So making sure that there's good time management, territory management, and that the salespeople we have here excel at establishing a relationship and managing these short, rapid engagement with the customers that they work with. And then lastly, there's consultative selling that requires excellence in customer engagement management and the ability to develop customers over time through customer success. So these different ways of selling here, depending on how you score yourself on these characteristics. And the challenge here is that if you're a big global company, it's very likely that you don't just have one way of selling that you need to succeed with. You might have all 5 of these different ways of selling that you need to get working simultaneously in your company. So you might have, if you were a logistics company, you might do specialty one-off transportations of difficult things, which would be in the technical sales category. You might do integrated logistics solutions, which would be in the enterprise sales category. You might even sell day-to-day transportation on the spot market, which would be more transactional selling. And then you might sell smaller services, which would be more like consultative selling that you're trying to expand customers' use on time. And you might even manage partner logistics companies as well. So as you become a global company that branches into many different offering types, that's where complexity starts to creep in as well, because you have to manage these different types of selling. But the point here is, depending on what type of selling you need to succeed with, that informs the type of sales team that you want to set to most effectively drive new sales and develop accounts. So if we have a more technical sales team, what we're hiring here more often sales engineers, so people who have engineering backgrounds, professional backgrounds within the area that they're supposed to sell. You might even hire technical specialists too, that don't necessarily have commercial responsibility, but are taking care of all the technical parts of the selling process. An inside sales rep, a content marketing specialist. So all of this centered around a more technical perspective on the sales team, and then some other types of specialist roles that support that. Whereas if we think about a partner team, then it's about driving sales through others rather than driving direct sales. So there we would much more look at the partner account structure and say some business decision makers, some partner salespeople, and maybe some partner marketers. And we're trying to cover that with our teams that sell from the different perspectives here. But the point is always the same. So regardless of whether you're trying to succeed with one team or the other, the question is always, who do I think would make the team's performance greater than the sum of its individual part? So if you think about that task where we're asking sales leaders to decide, who would you hire for your sales team? Would you hire 5 sales executives or some combination of the different types? Then essentially what's going on in people's head is that once they've gotten to 2-3 sales executives, they're starting to tell themselves that maybe the marginal value of adding another sales executive isn't good enough. Maybe I could add an inside sales rep instead, a customer success manager, and that would lift the sales effectiveness curve of the whole team as a whole. So essentially the question that we're asking all the time is, who do I think would add the most value to the team as a whole if I added that to the team right now? And that's where we are considering different roles. And regardless of the type of selling that you need to succeed with, that question remains the same. That's of course an easier transformation to succeed with than actually done in real life, because it's such a fundamental shift that we're making with teams that sell. If we think about how salespeople have been used to working for a long time, it's working alone, it's working their own way, and it's with low dependency on others. So it's a really, really difficult shift in mindset and ways of working for many sales organizations and for managers too, because they've been very much used to managing people who are like themselves, managing primarily through one-to-one. And they have to change as well. They have to be much better at establishing teams that are able to perform and managing people that don't necessarily have the same professional background as they do, because they might not be salespeople like themselves. So it's a very tricky sales transformation to succeed with, because it does away with some of these most fundamental ways that we've been organizing sales for a long time. So even if we know that teams win in sales when complexity grows, we saw that in the numbers in the beginning of this session, it is a very difficult transformation to succeed with. And there are really three key areas that you want to focus on in order to increase your odds of succeeding with this transformation here. The first is, as always, when we're doing these large-scale transformation initiatives, the trick is to figure out where you can start small in order to scale that big later. So figuring out where you can do the initial business case for teams that sell, do that, because then you have a much better story to go out to the rest of the organization with if you want to roll this out at a bigger scale. So starting small to learn how to set this up and get your internal story right, that allows you to branch this out into other parts of the organization. Second thing is to bring team leaders or sales managers on board early in this process here. We know from research that the sales managers are, of course, the most important ones to drive change at the front line, but they're also the ones who are most likely to resist change. So they're the ones we have to align ourselves with when we're making this transformation here, and making sure that they feel equipped to take on this new role as a team leader or team manager, rather than a manager of a group of individuals. And lastly, this is something where you can really make use of your commercial excellence or sales excellence function if you have one, because essentially they're the ones with the expertise in selling, and they're the ones with the expertise in change management. So this is a place where you can make really good use of that ability that they have in succeeding with those two things, because that's essentially what it is a transformation towards a new type of sales excellence. So just finally, we know that top salespeople, they already know that the way to succeed with selling is done as a team and not alone. We saw this in Salesforce's State of Sales report, where high performers were much more likely to work with selling as a team discipline. And essentially all that's happening now is that sales leaders are starting to decide, well, if that's true, how should we hardwire that into our organizational structure, instead of leaving it up to the initiative of individual high performers to go out and seek that collaboration. And that's essentially what Teams That Sell is. It's a hardwiring of what the best salespeople are already doing today. And I would urge you to either go out and get the book if you want to learn more about Teams That Sell, or we'll send out some links as well afterwards to places where you can read more about this. But with that, I want to thank you guys for listening in to the presentation here, and then we'll just jump into a Q&A with some questions for the last 15 minutes that we have. I'm just going to jump back into this here. So the first question here is, who is Teams That Sell not relevant for? And obviously, I think it's relevant for the vast majority of B2B sales teams out there. But I would say if you're a kind of company that have a more simple sales process, because your customers, you're selling into a more simple buying process, and you have a very narrow product portfolio, then Teams That Sell isn't necessarily the best way for you. And the reason is that you'd probably be better off looking at how you could run a very, very efficient sales process, because it's a simple sales process, and how you would optimize on that. So there you would probably much more look at it like a factory line, where you try to carve in the buying process into different journeys and figure out how to drive each step of that journey most efficiently, because you're able to do so when you have a simple buying process that doesn't vary much, because your product is more or less the same. So we have these three different types of ways we can set up sales organizations overall. An island setup where each salespeople just does everything themselves, a factory line or assembly line setup where we try to organize the buying journey into steps and then have different specialists working on each of those towards a deal. And then finally, teams that sell, where we have different specialists working together in teams. And for some organizations, having the assembly line or factory line set up is a better way of doing it because they can drive high efficiency there. But again, I would say for most teams that sell is in B2B anyway, because we're working with higher complexity a lot of the time, is a preferred setup. And then there's some cases where it still makes more sense to do the assembly line. Other question is, what do you do if you're not organized into teams that sell, but collaboration is still important? And I think what's meant here is what we've been talking about in this session here is the organizational aspect of teams that sell, making sure that we're actually set up with the right composition of people in our sales teams to succeed in the new B2B selling environment. But the reality is that that's not the way a lot of commercial organizations are set up today. They might be set up into industry specialty groups, functional specialty groups like marketing, inside sales. So they're divided into different functions, but we're still dependent on these different types of specialists to collaborate. And in those cases, collaboration is just as important. But we don't necessarily want to reorganize. So what you do there is that you still have to pinpoint and specify what are those important points of collaboration, where different types of specialists like technical specialists, product specialists, sales specialists, marketing specialists, they have to come together and collaborate around selling, and how are they going to succeed with that. So it still becomes very important to specify these different selling situations, or maybe even more important because they're not on the same team, and start working with that team on how to succeed in that. So even if you're not organized into teams that sell, you still have to specify those different situations where different specialists need to collaborate. How would you approach moving towards a more specialized sales team? I think as always, the way I would approach these kinds of things is figuring out where it would be best to test out if teams that sell is right for your organization and create the business case for that. So figuring out what geographical location, what industry, where would you gain the most from showing a business case for teams that sell, and then starting first with setting the right team for that. So who should be on the team? Once you've set the team, the first thing you need to do is get that team on the same page. So that essentially means that if you have different team members that are on a team together, what happens very often is that no one actually set those team members down and got them to have a shared perspective on what's our purpose, what's our goal, our ways of working, and so on, dependencies on each other. So I would figure out where to do the pilot. Then the other thing I would do is start working with that team on making sure that we're on the same page there. That's probably how you would get started on it. For getting teams that sell to work, would you suggest that some marketing's role will move into the sales team? Well, I would definitely suggest that marketing are involved in teams that sell. But I think the way to look at it isn't necessarily that a marketing person moves from one team to the other. What you're much more likely to have when you're moving to teams that sell is what we call the helix organization, where you still have functional groups. So people are salespeople, they are customer success managers, they are marketing people, and those functional areas are basically the professional areas of expertise that they belong to. But on a day-to-day basis, they operate in these value-creating units, which is essentially teams that sell together with other types of specialists. So it's not necessarily that a marketing person is moving from one team to the other, but I would absolutely like to have marketing much more at the front line, involved in these teams that sell here, rather than sitting in another silo from those that have selling responsibility. And of course, as most people listening in on this call know, marketing is a huge driver of revenue growth, and they're a very big part of selling today because buyers have gone digital. So I would like to have those marketing managers as an integrated part of the team that sell, but I don't necessarily think it's about moving someone from marketing to sale. I think it's essentially doing away with this old way of looking at commercial organization design, where we've always just divided it into professional areas of expertise. Are you a marketer? Are you a salesperson? And then those are the people you work with. I think we need to do away with that and have different types of people work much more together in these value creating units. And I think that was the last question for this morning here. Thank you very much for listening in to Teams That Sell. I hope it was interesting. And if you're interested in learning more, make sure to go on Amazon and get the book, or go to our website and download the executive brief, where you can also learn more about Teams That Sell. Thank you very much and have a great day.